Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Lisa Royce. I'm Director of Exhibits at the National Archives Museum, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater, and a special welcome to our YouTube visitors as well, and audience. We are going to have some upcoming programs I just want to mention. One is in honor of our veterans, Caring for Our Heroes, on Thursday, November 5th at 7 p.m., and a second is Pivotal Tuesdays, 4 elections that shaped the 20th century, on Monday, November 9th at noon. Today's program is on Lady Bird and Lyndon, the hidden story of a marriage that made a president, by Dr. Boyd Caroli. It's her new book, and she will be signing it after the presentation today. Like Dr. Caroli, I did some extensive research in the holdings at the LBJ Library when I was the curator there. I did the first permanent exhibit on Lady Bird. She was such a, I don't know how to quite describe it, but unassuming personality that she didn't want a permanent exhibit about herself, but this was the first time a permanent exhibit was done. And so I was really delighted to be the person able to do that. However, when I started reading Betty's book, I have to admit it was hard to put down. There was so much. She's woven a compelling story that reveals an active political partner, an astute businesswoman, and a gracious networker that made Lady Bird key to Lyndon's success on the road to the White House. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Betty Boyd Caroli, who has authored a number of other books as well, and is going to talk to us about this book, Lady Bird and Lyndon.
Thank you, Lisa. Is this mic working? Can you hear me all right? And thank you all for coming in on such a gorgeous day. I mean, I think it was hard for all of us. Now, you're wondering what this is up here, if I'm supposed to be talking about another book, right? People ask me why I decided to write about Lady Bird Johnson, and the answer is when I did the book on all First Ladies in the 1980s, I was pretty sure I had it wrong about her. Because I echoed what most historians were saying about her at that time, most biographers of Lyndon, that she was a shy person who always stayed in the background, who didn't have political opinions, and very much overshadowed by Lyndon, who often could be verbally abusive to her, as he was to many people. And somehow this picture didn't fit even then, because I knew that she had bought this broadcasting business and made it into a very profitable outfit. And I saw that she had a very organized, competent staff in the White House. And so for a long time, I wanted to get into this research better. And I got into it after she died, actually, in 2007, when a whole lot of papers that were not available before became available. For example, the courtship letters between Lady Bird and Lyndon were only completely available in February. It was Valentine's Day, I think, in 2013. The interviews, she gave many interviews over her lifetime, and those were pulled together, and some of them were published in a book by Michael Gillette in 2014. But all of them are available online, and you really have to, if you're really interested in Lady Bird, you have to do both. You have to read the interviews online, and you have to look at Michael Gillette's book, because he was a good friend of hers. For example, he went back to her hometown for her high school reunion, her 50th reunion, and she told him things that she had never said in any of those interviews. So it's good to read the Gillette book and also listen to the interviews. Those became all available. The telephone conversations that had been available if you really went to the library and put on the earphones and listened, those became available online. Anybody can go online now and listen to Lady Bird and Lyndon talking on the phone about different matters. What else became available? Many, many materials. Her home movies. She started doing home movies in 1941, and you can go online and look at those, just a wonderful. So there were many, many papers that had not been used before, and so I did sign a contract in 2009, even before some of these papers were sure to be opened, and the result is a book that I think corrects some of the things I said then, now I have to decide how to get another slide. So this is just the last edition. That First Lady's book went through 4 different editions. The last one is up through Michelle Obama, and it was published in 2010. Okay, here's a picture that is the typical, as I said, the overpowering figure, the +1. You know, those of us who write biographies of women often say we write the +1. You have the main figure, and then you have the +1. Here she's very much overshadowed by her tall, commanding husband, just as he overshadowed many people. I mean, this picture of him with Abe Fortas, you know, he was 6'3", and everybody said he seemed much taller than that. And she was pictured as the flower lady, you know, the one who planted the flowers. Well, in Washington, we don't have to convince you that her environmental program reached far and wide. She was very overshadowed, it seems to me, by being in the shadow of Jacqueline Kennedy, who was one of the most popular, iconic first ladies of all time. Here they're shown going to, you know, the Senate wives called themselves the Red Cross unit for a while, and there she is, Lady Bird, when she's the wife of the vice president, leading Jacqueline Kennedy, who's the first lady, into a lunch that they were giving to honor her. So to get rid of this picture of the shy backflower, the shy, what is it, the one in the background, what do we call those? The in the shadow. Wallflower, that's the word I was looking for. The wallflower. I started with her youth. And I went to Karnak, Texas. Those of you who've been there know that it's a very, very small town right at the border with Louisiana. And she lived in a house that is very, very impressive. They generally say it has 17 rooms, 6 fireplaces, those big columns out front, presided over by her father, T.J. Taylor, who liked to be called by everybody Mr. Boss, because he was one of the most commanding people in town, richest man in town. It was interesting for me to get a picture from the people who knew her then of what kind of a young woman she was. I interviewed one woman who had known her as a young woman, and by the time I was talking to this woman, she was well in her 90s, of course, and she said that Lady Bird, and here you do get a sense, sorry, we don't want that. I wanted to go back and show you her as a little girl. Very well dressed. She must have stood out a lot in that community because the daughter of the richest person around, this woman that I interviewed said, you know, she had a car at 13. My family didn't even have a car then. So there was an enormous amount of envy, I think. She had a checking account as a 13-year-old, I think. And Bess Abel, whom I interviewed, said that when she once gave Lady Bird Johnson a check, Lady Bird, because she needed to reimburse her for some expense, Lady Bird looked at the check and realized that it was from a joint checking account and questioned Bess Abel about whether or not she had a joint checking account, and Bess said she did. And Lady Bird said, I wouldn't have a joint checking account with the angel Gabriel. And she had learned really good business practices, I think, from her father, who was, who everybody said stuck to his business ledgers. He never read a book until he started reading to Lady Bird after her mother died, and she had nobody to read to her. But he was a demon with figures, and he passed that on to Lady Bird. Now, this is Lyndon Johnson, who looked just like he looked later, right, even at this age, who grew up about 300 miles west. And it is a different world, as those of you who've been there know. His house is a lot smaller, and this is what it looks now. People who were there, because the original house that he was born in was torn down in the early 1940s and was replaced by one that most people agree is larger than the original. It's still very small. You can walk through this, those low ceilings, 4 small rooms, and it's a world away from the house that Lady Bird grew up in. In fact, I should say that the reason I started studying First Ladies in the first place was that I didn't want to do the topic because I was teaching women's history. I wanted to write about a woman who did not become famous because of the man she married, but because of what she had done on her own. And my editor at the time rejected the person I wanted to write about and said, why don't you write about presidents' wives? And I said, no. And she said, well, what do you know about them? And I said, well, I know a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt and a little bit about Abigail Adams. And she said, well, maybe if you knew more, you'd be more interested. And so that summer, while I was doing research on the topic I wanted to write about, I was up in Cambridge, Mass. At the Harvard Library looking at the papers. Whenever I had to wait for a box to come up, I would pull down an encyclopedia and just flip to a president's wife that I knew nothing about, like Sarah Polk or Lucretia Garfield. And I remember standing there with the book in my hand one day, and I said, these women all married down. They married men from families less wealthy, often less well-educated. Why did they do it? I see why the men married up. Ambitious men marry up, right? But why did the women marry down? And so I went back to my editor and I said, okay, I'll do that I'll do that book because I want to answer that question. And I really decided that in the time, Lady Bird and Lyndon completely fit this picture, right? That in Lady Bird's time and those women who came before her, an ambitious woman, one way to get what she wanted was to marry a man who was ambitious too. And that a woman who could not get into politics or some other good field would often find that advance through the man she married. So that Johnson certainly fit that pattern of the woman marrying down. And you know, Lyndon Johnson was always reminding her of, well, you have 2 degrees from the University of Texas. Certainly you can do that. And of course, he knew that the University of Texas ranked far above his alma mater, which was a teacher's college, Southwest Texas Teachers College in San Marcos. So they came from very different backgrounds. And you'll notice that I showed you a picture of Lady Bird alone, but here you see Lyndon, second from your right, with his 3 younger sisters and his little brother. The oldest of 5 and very much the apple of his mother's eye. You know, his mother had gone to the University of Texas, Baylor University, and had gotten a university degree and had the desire to write the great Confederate novel. So she worked a bit as a journalist, but her father's fortunes fell apart and she had to go to work. Lyndon, his siblings said, could be very bossy. You know, their father was in the state legislature in Texas, and when he had to be away in Austin for weeks or days or weeks at a time, somebody had to take care of the ranch, do the chores and so forth. And Lyndon, being the oldest, was kind of put in charge. And his siblings said that he quickly found ways to pass those jobs on to them so that he could be doing what he really wanted to do. What I found in Lady Bird's youth was that she was much more adventuresome than certainly I had thought. Here's a picture of her in a plane. She later in one of the interviews describes this. I think she's just standing here on the ground, but she talked about taking a flight, and she said it was the greatest adventure of my young life. It was lots of fun. Here she is, looking very fetching in a fur. And here she is with a group of, she was elected to the athletic board in college, and here she is, the one on your far left in the first row, looking really more like a debutante than a Women's Athletic Association board member, right? So the idea that she was unpopular in school is just false. I mean, she's here, elected to this board. The oral histories of her friends at the University of Texas talk about the dating. And one thing that became very clear to me in reading the oral histories was that she dated young men that she thought would go someplace. The younger brother of the woman who introduced Lyndon to Lady Bird got dropped right away because Lady Bird said, he'll never amount to much. This is the courtship picture. Now remember that Lyndon and Lady Bird met on September 5, 1934, introduced by that woman I just mentioned, who was an old friend of Lady Bird's and certainly knew Lyndon. They were introduced on a Wednesday afternoon, and they spent about 5 days together, and then he had to go back to Washington, where he was working as a secretary to a congressman. For the next 8 weeks or so, until he came back at Halloween and surprised her, they exchanged letters. And in one of those letters, he asks her for a picture, and she sends him this one. And then he sends her this one. And she looks at it and writes him back, "You do look arrogant in that picture, and you know how I hate arrogance. But in your case, I decided it was just a nice self-confidence, and I liked it." Now, I don't know whether you can read what he wrote, but it is for Bird, a lovely girl with ideals, principles, intelligence, and refinement from her sincere admirer, Lyndon. It's, and this is the letters, and there are about 80 of them. You can, as I said, read them online. He started writing her. Remember, during those 5 days, he already started asking her to marry him. She says she thinks it was on their very first date that he asked her, and she thought he was crazy. And I have to say, when I was doing the first ladies' book, I couldn't figure out why a woman as careful as she was, who always studied everything before she made a decision, how she could marry somebody just a few weeks later that she'd spent very little time with. Well, anyway, he begged her to marry him before he left on that Tuesday morning, the following Tuesday after the Wednesday that they met. And he sat down in the motel the very first night. It was a kind of a 3-day drive back to Washington. He sat down in the motel in Tennessee, as I recall, and wrote her the first letter. And then this is one that I put in the book just because I could get it all on one page. It was one of the shorter ones. Some of them go on for pages and pages. But it says, and I'll read it in case, "My dearest, tonight I'm a sick little man. Am going to bed without looking at a law book." Remember, he had just signed up for law school. "The flu hit me today, and if I don't feel better in the morning, I won't go to the office. I wish you were here to nurse me, but you aren't. Good night, honey, Lyndon." And that, you get that theme through all the letters. He keeps talking about needing her to nurse me and to help me to climb and to reach the place that I want to be. And of course, he was writing her from the Dodge Hotel, and he's noticed the address, Miss Bird Taylor, Karnak, Texas. And that's what everybody called her then, the Lady Bird. You know, one of the things I explain in the book is that story about her getting the name from the nurse is just wrong, according to her. She said in one of her interviews that she, as a child, growing up in that big house I just showed you, had very few playmates. In fact, if you go to that house, there aren't any houses right close. And the playmates she had were those of the hired help, and they were African Americans. And the one little boy, whose name I think was Doodlebug, and his friend Stuff, decided that Claudia, which was her real name, was not too much fun. And so they gave her the name Lady Bird. But later, because it was considered inappropriate to say anything about her having interracial playmates, you know, that story about the nurse was invented. In any case, it was not used. All of the people who knew her in the 30s referred to her in their oral histories as Bird. It's only about 1939, after the Johnsons have been in Washington for a while, and after FDR becomes known. If you think about it, I don't think there's a president before FDR who gets known by his initials that way. Later, TR, up a little bit, but TR was known as Teddy. We had nicknames for presidents, Old Hickory and Tippecanoe and different nicknames. But this idea of being known by your initials really struck LBJ as a good idea. And so he becomes LBJ. And that's when people start talking about her as Lady Bird, which you notice is 2 words. Now, Lady Bird the bug is just 1 word, right? And anyway, a lady bird is not the caterpillar type thing is not very pretty anyway. So why would you say anybody was pretty as a ladybird? Anyway, the courtship letters were a big source for me because they really showed, I think, the Lyndon that we came to know later. His penchant for secrecy. You know, he'd write her these letters, "Oh, big things are happening, but I can't tell you what they are." And she'd write back, "Oh, please tell me." And then, "Oh, no, I fear the outcome too much to tell you what it would be." So the secrecy was there. His neediness was there. He constantly says, you know, put a little love in your letters. put it in between the lines and how he doesn't think it's wrong to show emotion, and he hopes she'll show what he needs from her. He also shows, I think, that he is not necessarily a monogamous man. In about can't be many letters, I think it's about September 26th or so, he writes her that he's been out dancing and dining with a little radio writer named Helen, and they had a really good time. And it's not just one letter like that, it's 3 or 4. Now, I looked carefully to see how Lady Bird answered. She never mentioned the little radio writer. She evidently knew that this Helen was the daughter of a New York judge and a very sophisticated person. And later in her interviews, after Lyndon is dead, she says, I knew that relationship between Helen and Lyndon was not platonic, but I knew that she was a very sophisticated woman, and I thought maybe she'd sharpen up Lyndon's social skills. So that, I think, is an early indication of what's to come. This is a picture, well, just to repeat the dates now, they met on September 5th. He comes back at Halloween. They spend a little time together, but she had already planned a trip. We're talking 1934, right? She had already planned a trip to see some relatives in Alabama and her Aunt Effie, who had kind of taken care of her when she was young. So she went off on that trip and then comes rushing back to Lyndon and says, okay, let's get married. And they get in the car and start driving towards San Antonio, and they marry on a Saturday evening in 1934, November 17, with virtually nobody there. I mean, nobody that Lady Bird knew, just her roommate who lived nearby came over. The rest were people she had never seen before. They marry, they have a short honeymoon in Mexico, and then they drive back to Washington so he can resume his job as a secretary to a congressman. And they arrive on New Year's Eve, and that begins her very long living time in Washington, D.C. It's not so long at that particular stretch because he gets another job in Texas that July, and they go back to Texas for a year and a half. But here she is in 1941, after he had been elected he was elected in 1937. Remember, a congressman died in Texas, and Lyndon ran for the seat. And it's always said that Lady Bird put up the money. And that's why Lyndon married her. At least many people said, I always thought that was the case. In fact, when it came time for him to run in that special election, it was a crowded field. It was a one-shot. In other words, there was going to be no runoff. And it was, I think, about 6 weeks it lasted. It was just a matter of days, really, starting in February of 1937. And he needed money. And so you'd think if she was so rich, he would just say, okay, and if he was so commanding as people thought, he would just say, okay, Bird, give me the money, right? He may have said that, but what she did was to go to an advisor, a person she called our brain trust, the man we trust more than anybody, Alvin Wirtz, and she said, does Lyndon have a chance in this race? And he said, yes, he has a chance. And the second question was, how much money will it take? And the answer was $10,000. So as somebody said, before she bought a car, she kicked the tires to see if it had any, what was left in it. She wasn't going to invest in a man she loved if he had no chance of winning the election. It's funny because one of the man who ran that election, Claude Wild, in his oral history, and this has been repeated by a lot of biographers, he said, yes, Lady Bird at that time was a nice, sweet little young lady, I think he said, but she had no interest at all in politics, and so she kept quiet. What Lady Bird said was, I knew that campaign manager didn't want women in politics, not one bit, so I stayed out. So you see, you get different views of her role in that campaign. This one, though, this picture is the 1941 Senate campaign, which they lost. And funny enough, she said it was her very favorite because she got the excitement of a campaign, the fervor of people who were really committed to an idea. And you see there with her little movie camera, which Lyndon had given her for Christmas. And she goes around taking pictures of the opposition, recording what's in their speeches. My editor said, now we call that opposition research. At that time, she was just covering the campaign. This is part of her home movie section that, again, you can watch on internet. One of the things that is often held against Lady Bird Johnson is that she was not really a committed mother. She had a lot of trouble getting pregnant. She had several miscarriages, a tubal pregnancy. This picture is 1948, after she had given birth to their first daughter. That's on the left is Linda Bird, and who was born in March of 1944, just before the war ended, and then little Lucy, born in July of 1947. Notice those black eyes that Lyndon has. Does he look tired or what? That's just at the end of the 1948 campaign. Remember, there were two primaries that year. He had surgery. It was a terribly difficult campaign. And this is the picture of them with the two daughters. I neglected to say that when I'm mentioning the war, as soon as Pearl Harbor was announced, Lyndon signed up for active duty. Lady Bird was not in Washington at that time. She was in Alabama going over the estate of her uncle, who had just died, because she'd been named for him. His name was Claude. It was her mother's brother. And she knew that she would inherit quite a bit of the estate. And she was down there going through the books and to see what was coming to her. She didn't wait for lawyers to tell her. She went down and looked at the situation herself. When she got back to Washington, Lyndon had already enlisted for active duty, and she took over his office, ran his office without pay for the months until he came back. And everybody said she did it so well that people didn't even know Lyndon was absent. Here's a family picture after they bought the ranch. They bought the ranch in 1951, and occupied it by the fall of 52. And it's one of the rare family pictures you see of them. There really aren't that many to. Lady Bird said, as long as we're talking about her as a mother, that she knew that she hadn't given the attention to her daughters that they wanted, but she said, not enough for me to have a guilt complex about it. Because she said Lyndon always came first, and then the girls, and then herself. Now the girls said Lyndon came first, her broadcasting business came second, and we came third. But in any listing, she always put herself as last. And she played many roles. I mean, this was my decision, that she played many roles in Lyndon's career and in his rise. She was certainly his emotional stabilizer. You know, you read in her diary that his moods would go up and down. He's feeling really bad today, and then next day he's top of the world. And she was one of the people who could get him on even keel and get him, Lyndon put one foot in front of the other, she would say. This picture, and I see we're going to have to move quickly because we're not very far into this. This picture is taken, I think you'll recognize, aboard Air Force One. It's a little dark. Air Force One on November 22, 1963, when the Johnsons are waiting for Jackie Kennedy to join them so that Lyndon can be inaugurated into the job of president. And she then arrives, and this picture, neither of these is that famous picture that you see. Here, you notice how Lady Bird is leaning forward, trying to console Jackie, talking to her. That was a role that she often played. This picture is pretty historic because it is the only time in our history, I think, that the widow of a deceased president is there for the inauguration of her husband's successor. I looked carefully at the pictures of Eleanor Roosevelt for Harry Truman's inauguration, and there were a lot of people around, but there's no Eleanor in sight. She was certainly in the White House. She could have been there. But in this case, the Johnsons waited for her because they thought it was important to show, that was a very traumatic time, and it was important to show succession, that a continuity, that there's sort of do that. diary. When I talk about her diary, I should make very clear, she published, maybe I have it here, I do have her published diary here somewhere. She published 800 pages when she left the White House, but her unpublished diary is 8 times that. And it's not a diary in the sense that she wrote each day. She would record into her little tape recorder, and then somebody would transcribe that, and that became the basis that she used here, and it's the basis for much of what I wrote. She said on the day that she became First Lady, that is November 22, 1963, that she felt like she was on stage for a part she never rehearsed. But in fact, she was the best qualified First Lady, I think, of all time. Remember, she had lived in Washington for 30 years. She knew journalists by first name. These are congressmen's wives. And remember, she was a very loyal member of the wives of congressmen and wives of senators. She never missed a Tuesday meeting of the Senate wives. And these are women from those groups who volunteered to help her answer the mail that poured in after John Kennedy's assassination. This was taken at the Elms, which was their residence. Here she is, and I'll move quickly now so we can have time for questions. Here she is in one of my favorite modes. Lyndon would often put her on the phone for a difficult phone conversation. For example, when they were on the Air Force One coming back from Dallas that day in '63, one of the calls they made was to Rose Kennedy. That had to be a terribly difficult call to make. And he put Lady Bird on to say a few words because she was extremely gracious and kind and consoling, and that was one way she helped him. This is another way. I mean, talk about a people pleaser, always gracious. And it wasn't just social visitors that she greeted that way and soothed. I interviewed people who worked for them who said, Lyndon could be really difficult, but she always had the nice words. She made you feel good. One of the people I interviewed was a White House photographer, and he told me about being at the ranch one day, and the Johnsons were both there, and Lady Bird asked the photographer to go out and take pictures of some wildflowers. So the photographer and his assistant went over a few fields away and were taking pictures when suddenly a helicopter came to summon them home to a very angry President Johnson, who said, "Why were you over there when I wanted you over here?" And the photographer said to me, I felt really, because he was there when she told us to go, why didn't he say something? It was so unfair. But then Lady Bird came in and said, he didn't mean it. He's just upset. You know how much we like you. We regard your work. She made him feel so good. He said, I don't know about Lyndon Johnson, but I would walk over hot coals for Lady Bird. He was really extremely... So this is another... I think we don't quite understand, don't recognize how much she was an advisor to him. People would say Lyndon Johnson trusted nobody 100% of the time, but he trusted his wife more than anybody else. And here they are, obviously aboard a plane, and she's giving him some. Here Lady Bird is with her press secretary. And that I was really amazed at how competently she put together a staff. No First Lady had even had a press secretary who did anything. Jackie Kennedy had a press secretary who was a personal friend, not at all aware of press duties, and her instructions were to keep the press away. Liz Carpenter really put together some very good press coverage for First Lady. Here she is in the office looking over some papers. And I almost wanted this for the jacket photo because it signifies so much. I think the one that was chosen is better, but this one, that she shielded her husband from so much criticism just by her graciousness with other people. Here she is aboard a plane. You see it's the president's with his back to us, and then you have, on the president's right, you have Tommy Thompson, the ambassador to Russia, and you have McNamara and Lady Bird. And I don't think they're talking about the weather, do you? I mean, they're in deep conversation. Here she is on her own anti-poverty trip to Kentucky, where she walked to get to a backwoods school, and she said, I washed my hands in a zinc bucket like the one that I had when I went to a country school in Texas. And here she is. She says more than once. Lyndon always liked the prettiest woman in the room beside him. And here it is, and then she names the person who's in that picture. As I said, when she left the White House, she did what every First Lady since her has done, except for Pat Nixon. She wrote her White House diary. And I always like to point out that she did it a lot quicker than Lyndon wrote his. You know, she put it together, and Lyndon had a little trouble meeting his deadline. Lyndon Johnson died, as we all know, just at the end of another term, on January 22nd, 1973. If he had been elected to another term, he would just have made it. And Lady Bird had 34 years after that. That's a long time, but it's not too different from what a lot of women have. And she said to a reporter that she had a shelf which she put, during her marriage, she'd put things on a shelf that she would do later. And after his death, she took those down. And one of them was travel. And here she's shown in Venice. She didn't like Venice. I was told very clearly by one of her friends that she didn't like Venice at all. But here, and Venice is not her kind of city, is it? Because I lived part of every year in Venice, I was disappointed to hear that. Actually, my hairdresser in Venice talked about the day that she came, and she remembered, you know what she remembered about that trip? She remembered that the Secret Service men had these big black shoes, and they clumped around the salon while Lady Bird was getting her hair done. And Lady Bird socialized with some of the people that Lyndon Johnson had no use for, the people he called those Harvard East Coast liberals. Here she is shown at Martha's Vineyard, where she rented a house for a month, several summers in the 1980s, and she's on the boat with Walter Cronkite, the man that her husband had a big fight with about those interviews that were given, and Lyndon didn't think they were edited quite right. Actually, Lady Bird and Lyndon were at the University of Texas in the journalism school at the same time, but they didn't know each other. So she looks very pleased with herself. And she spent a lot of time with her daughters and granddaughters. Here she's shown with the granddaughters in Alaska. Took them on luxurious trips. Their parents said she spoiled them. And she became a sort of icon of other first ladies. Here, we can look at that circle, Nancy Reagan. They all learned from her, and they wrote their autobiographies. They all took a cause for themselves when they were in the White House. And she liked associating with them. She went on the Board of Regents of the University of Texas. Here she's shown at a meeting. And so I tried to sum all that up in my book, Lady Bird and Lyndon. I tried to show how he really needed what she offered, and that it was an extremely valuable teamwork. And we're all the results of that. We all see the results of that. You know, there's that book that came out a year or so ago talking about the powers of two, how two people together, whether it's husband and wife, the Wright brothers, or two scientists working together, or a composer and a lyricist. The book talks about the powers of two, and that's what I see. She's not the woman behind the throne. I dislike that metaphor. She's part of an important team, and she saw herself as that. She said, we're much better together than we are separate. And I think that's an important legacy for her to leave. I should have planted one. I didn't plant a question. You should have a question. You're from Texas. We have
We have a Texan here.
A Texan here.
I heard that Lady Bird would sometimes say, Lady Bird, grade me on a speech I've done, or he would actually ask her to, critique him.
Well, even better than asking him, we can hear her giving him the grade. And she calls him and she says, do you want to hear my critique of your press conference now, or you want to hear it later? And he says, okay, now, ma'am, like a school kid being about to be paddled. And so she says, well, I thought you talked too fast. Your eyes were looking down too much. And you answered that question wrong. You shouldn't have said that. And he said, well, and then he becomes defensive. And he said, well, they rushed me. They told me I had to hurry. And well, no, I didn't mean to say that, And you can hear it yourself. So the people who say that she never talked back to him, they just don't know those telephone conversations. There's that wonderful one that shows, I think, the relationship. That when they heard about the Walter Jenkins arrest, Lyndon was in New York and Lady Bird was in Washington. And she called him. Everybody knows, right, Walter Jenkins, in 1964, about 4 weeks before the election, the biggest election of their lives, because Lyndon was running for the presidency in his own right. Their top aide, a man who had worked for them since 1939, was arrested in a Washington restroom on what was called a morals charge, but was really a homosexual encounter with another person. And so this, of course, once that word was getting out, it opened him to vulnerability to blackmail. And as the top aide, I mean, he was the one who did their taxes. He knew everything about them. This was a very delicate situation. And Lady Bird called Lyndon, and she said, I think we should offer him, clearly he would have to leave the job he had as top aide to the president. But she said, I think we should offer him the number 2 job in the broadcasting business. And Lyndon said, you can't do that. You'll get in trouble with the FCC. You just keep out of this. This is nothing for you to get involved in. And she keeps talking. And he says, look, I've got a plane waiting for me, because he was in New York campaigning for Bobby Kennedy, who was running for senator. I know that's hard to believe that he was in New York campaigning for Bobby Kennedy, but he was. And he said, the plane's waiting for me. I've got to go. And she keeps him on the line. And he said, I think you should talk to Clark Clifford about this and Abe Fortas. And she said, I already have. I mean, she was, so then finally they closed that conversation, and she writes up a statement that says, our hearts go out today to Walter Jenkins, who's been working so hard, 18-hour days for so long, and this nervous breakdown. We should all be praying for his family and for him. I know I am. And then she called in the editor of the Washington Post and said, will you publish it? And they did. So there are many times that she disagrees with Lyndon, and it's easy to prove. Yes, that was the answer to your question, right? Or not? I forget what the question was now. Yeah, okay. Yes.
I actually have a question about in your introduction. You talked about self-made women, and you were on a quest for a specific woman outside of the First Ladies. Could you tell us who that was and why, and did you ever get that book together?
Okay, the book was about Mary Kingsbury Simkovich, and my editor said nobody will know who she is or want to read a book about some. She was really the mother of public housing. She was a New England woman who was one of the first women students at the University of Berlin, married a Russian who was much younger than she, and started a settlement house in New York where her children also lived. She had 2 children. Jane Addams, we hear about Jane Addams, but this is a different kind of story. And then she goes on she's very important in the housing law that was passed in the 30s under FDR. And I thought she deserved a book. But it's very hard to get a book about an unknown woman published. And no, I haven't published it. It's in my basement, as I say. I have different versions. I have a kind of popular version, and then I have an academic version. And so I'm going back to that. Thank you for the publicity. Yes.
The way you are describing the relationship after the courtship seems to be more of a business relationship than a romantic relationship. Were they into each other after the first X number of years?
The common picture of his criticizing her, as I said, her looks, her hair, her clothes, and treating her badly, that's the one that makes you think that he really didn't care about her. But I had many people tell me, give specific instances of when, how often he would take her arm, and like that first picture in a way, where they're walking on the South Lawn. But also I remember, I think it was Walter McPherson, said that they were in a meeting, a pretty important meeting, and Lady Bird came in to show Lyndon a new dress she had, an evening dress, because she didn't spend much money on clothes, but she liked beautiful evening wear. And she came in and she turned around, and Lyndon looked like a teenager in love, that there was that great admiration. And he said, the best thing I ever did was marry her. Now, you might think that's just a practical consideration. But yes, I do think the electric going that she discussed, that she felt on the day she met him in 1934, I do think that lasted till the end. There was a genuine regard and affection. Certainly they went through some tough times. And she talks about, particularly the White House years, she said the first couple years were wine and roses, and after that it was pure hell. And so it had difficult times, yes. Other questions? Yes.
Just another one, the picture you showed of all the first ladies sitting together. How do you know they, I'm sure some had favorites more than others. Do they all seem to get along? Were they cordial? Were there
They have a very close sisterhood. I say it's the most select sorority on earth, right? And they tend to support each other. Rosalind Carter talked to me about Lady Bird and how important Lady Bird was to her, because remember that campaign trip that Lady Bird took in 1964? No woman had ever done that. No person had ever done that before. That is the spouse of a candidate going out and campaigning on her own. Now they all do it. They all go out and raise money and so forth. But that was new. It was a very gutsy thing to do. And in a hostile territory, I mean, people yelled things. The Secret Service people were afraid that bombs might be under the tracks. You know, it was a very gutsy thing for her to do. And Rosalind Carter said, you know, I watched that from Georgia. And she said, I always said in the White House that Lady Bird was my favorite first lady. Laura Bush has said how much growing up in Texas she admired Lady Bird. I don't know that the others, they tend to support each other a lot. They're rarely critical. I don't think I could think of an example of one of them saying, well, that was the stupidest thing I ever heard of. No, they don't do that. Other questions? Oh, you're going to ask a question, you're leaving. No, I didn't want to embarrass you if you were leaving. But now,
I wondered about the LBJ Memorial here in Washington, how that came about. And
oh, I don't know. That's not in my book, so you'll have to tell me that.
Oh.
As Washingtonians, do you know, Lisa?
No, I don't.
Mm-hmm. You know, Lady Bird was very important in preserving the legacy of LBJ. She started almost as soon as he was elected in his own right. She started working on the library, choosing an architect, deciding where it would be located. You know, presidential libraries until that time had been in little towns like Hyde Park, New York for FDR, or West Branch, Iowa for Herbert Hoover. She said, not for us. It needs to be in a big city where people will visit it and associated with a university. And that was such a smart idea. Last night I was speaking in New York, and a man came up to me after the talk and said that he was one of the architects who worked with her, and how impressed he was. Oh, every detail, you know, like what the walls would be so that the exhibits could be attached in a good way on eye level, and how everybody would enter the same door, whether you were a visitor looking at the exhibit or a researcher going up to the 10th floor, which is where I worked. It was amazing. And then, of course, the childhood home of Lyndon, she started working on restoring that right away. She even worked with some people to restore her house to a historic site, but that got nowhere because that's still in private hands, which is another story. Question?
This is kind of connected to the question you just answered, but there's a park, Lady Bird Johnson Park, across the river, and I'm curious if you have an origination of she was taking a walk somewhere, saw something that needed to be fixed, and started on a path that resulted in improvements in the Washington area for plants and other things.
Well, her interest in nature and the environment goes way back to that lonely childhood. Remember, I say she raised herself, really. Her mother died when she was 5. She had 2 older brothers, but they were away at boarding school and never got home. So she really, as I said when I was talking about her playmates, she was really very much on her own. And she said the outdoors, the wildflowers, roaming across the fields, nature was my kingdom. It saved my life, you know. So that dedication to the preservation of the environment and the idea of conservation, that is authentic, was authentic, and it went back to the very beginning, which I often say for some of these other first ladies is not the case. I mean, some of them, I haven't heard anything about Nancy Reagan's Just Say No to Drugs for a very long time. Barbara Bush has not really continued the literacy program in any big way, or maybe you can correct me on that. Even Rosalind Carter, she's taken on other interests, but the mental health continues to be. Anyway, it was an authentic interest of hers, and it goes back, and it continued after she left the White House. She kept giving an award in Texas to the person who was most important in beautification of highways. She did that up until she hit 90 and felt that her eyes were beginning to deteriorate and she was having trouble moving, and she said, I need to pass this on to somebody else. But the Wildflower Center that she established on her birthday, and I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's a wonderful site. So it's an authentic interest that reached back to the beginning. Now, as for Washington, you know, when she decided she would go into conservation, the program that became beautification, there was a split about how much of her time and money should be spent on Washington and how much should be spent on parks across the country. And I discussed that. There's a chapter in the book discussing how that she managed to satisfy them all. The people who said we need to plant flowers and clean statues in Washington, as well as the ones who said we need to go to the poor neighborhoods and help those people improve their environment. And then, of course, the national program with highway beautification, getting rid of junkyards. And I was in a town that I knew pretty well a couple weeks ago, and I said, I remember when there was a junkyard there before Lady Bird Johnson, because, of course, moving junkyards, putting them out of sight was one of her big aims. Okay, if there are no other questions, anybody has a personal question, I'll be glad to answer it, or other questions from...
Book signing in the theater or in the lobby, one level up.
One level up, okay.
Bookshop, and books will be available for purchase at discount.
Thank you very much.